apparently, some people forget that I'm brown. What does that mean? Before we get into what that means and what this little conversation is about, I will tell you that I'm going to film a video right after this one, which is a partner video, but it's going to be on the Storytime playlist because it is about my experiences with being a victim of racism. And at first I was going to combine them into one thing, but these are separate things, and it would just make more sense to have two different videos for it. The other one fits much better into a story time. And conversations generally are times where I get to learn more about myself. And in saying that, when I was talking to a friend, one that I will mention some of their words later on here, I was thinking, like, wait a second, like, I have a conversation normally to learn more about myself, so I guess this really isn't a good conversation. And then I thought, well, what am I talking about? Like, just because I am really speaking of other people's perceptions of me, of course that means I'm going to learn about me. I'm learning about me and how people perceive me. And then I could comment on those things like I plan to and learn more about myself. So, to get into it, what does it mean that people forget that I'm brown? People just sometimes forget that I'm a person of color. They sometimes forget that, I think what it's not even the fact that they don't see me as a Caucasian person. The three people that I'm going to talk about are all Caucasian, and so it's not that they see, like, literally see my skin as just like theirs. They just, I think, to reword it, and I should have asked them to reword it, but I didn't think of that till right now, and that's just my life. I think to reword it in my own words of what I think happens is they just forget that I am a person of color in the sense that I am not afforded necessarily all the same privileges that they are based on race and ethnicity and the color of my skin. That they forget that maybe I have been a victim of racism, whereas maybe they have not been, or have had very different or very, very, very few instances where they've ever had to think about race as much. Because for Caucasian people in Canada and North America and plenty of other places and globally, generally they're in positions of power and privilege. So I don't want to get crazy political, but I feel like I guess this is kind of political. So yeah. The first time I heard someone say this to me was about 8 to 10 years ago. And my friend said, I don't remember the capacity, but they basically said, like, I just forget that you're brown sometimes. So, like, I forgot. And I don't remember why we were talking about me being brown or whatever, but they had said something that they just were like, oh yeah, I guess you're brown. Like, I forgot about that. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that in my life. So, and I mean, if this was 8 to 10 years ago, I still would have been in my 20s. Like, I would have been in my early to mid 20s. And so it was just like, what? How do you forget that I'm brown? I see you every day. What do you mean you forget that I'm brown? I'm brown. And they were like, yeah, but I don't know. It was like lighthearted and fun, and we joked about it a bit. But I was like, but really, what does that mean? Like, how can you? I don't understand. What do you mean by that? Now, that initial conversation happened so many years ago that I don't recall it at all. But I did talk to them again just to get some of their input and some of their thoughts, and I think I'll share their thoughts last. And then I polled a couple other people from my life that have also expressed the same sentiment in different times in my life. Some people in the past couple of years, one person very recently. And so I did get some more input from these people before I made this video because I just thought it was interesting as to what does that mean? What does it mean that you forget that I'm brown? Why do you think you forget that I'm brown? Etc. So I'm going to start with that right now. And so I'm going to be looking at my phone in order to quote, quote some of these thoughts that were said. So somebody said, I can be staring directly at you and it doesn't click in my head that you are a person of color. It's not like I see a white man either. It just completely blanks on me, I guess. I'm not sure why it happens. I grew up in insert small town Alberta city, or small town in Alberta here. It's not like walking down the street you'd see very many people of color, if any. I wasn't raised seeing a wide variety of ethnicities or whatever. It throws me off when I see that. Oh yeah, so it throws me off when I see this picture because it's of us and they're very, very Caucasian and pale and white, and I am not. This picture was made by an artist, and so this artist did like a caricature of both of us, and the artist left them blank, like left their skin tone just the color of the paper, and colored me in brown. So when they see this, they notice that, and that's what they're talking about here. Wow, people can tell you're brown, but it makes sense because you are. Yeah, so continuing, and the few times that we've taken photos together, I go back and look at them. It takes me a second because the color of your skin pops out at me again. Then naturally I remember that you are a brown man, and the only thing that goes through my mind is crappy things, like I had an incident in a liquor store, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit if you don't know what that is, because it was in my Calgary vlog, the last one that I made. Yeah, remember, and the only thing that goes through my head is crappy things, like the day at the liquor store, or the time that you snapped me saying you didn't feel uncomfortable one time in the grocery store because it was all brown people, but I also see your dark skin at times. And you asked me how it made me feel. It doesn't make me feel any kind of way, really. I don't have a moment of visual clarity regarding your skin color while walking down the street and get uncomfortable or anything. It just makes me more aware of my white privilege. And that makes me sad, even though I joke about race and privilege and things of that nature. Yeah, so that was that one that I stumbled through. And I have some things to say to that. So I don't know, I guess that's one thing that, I don't know, I get to learn more about these people and I get to learn more about myself. And they basically said, like, oh, if it wasn't for these pictures that I see, sometimes I'd forget. So, like, in person, it's just kind of like, yeah, I don't remember you being a person of color. Like, they're so used to seeing me on a day-to-day basis, as one case, there's one example or something that I can think of, that they just don't notice that, yes, I am different. I guess it would be like if you were born and raised, you know, with like a foster sibling. I mean, if they were always there from the time that you remember, and you were both growing up together and you were young, and they were an African American and you were a Caucasian, and maybe you just never thought of like, oh yeah, they're different from me. Like at some point I think you'd realize it, but for a long time you'd be like, oh, that means something? Like what does it even mean? Like it's different? Like people treat us differently? And then the whole thing of racism comes up and whatever else, right? But that's kind of what I gleaned from this response. That saying, I can be just staring directly at you and it doesn't click in my head that you're a person of color. But that also means to me that that's obviously not the most important part of our relationship, or it doesn't really play a part in our relationship, that it's not the first thing they think of when they see me, because it doesn't matter. Because there's other qualities that I have that even physical qualities that don't really have to do with my skin, that maybe they notice more, that just are more noticeable to them or what have you. So that's good, I guess. But they also mentioned that they grew up in a very small town where there weren't a lot of people of color around, so they were kind of playing this idea that, like, you'd think that maybe people of color would jump out to me more because I'm not used to it, or I wasn't used to it in my youth, and now, like, I'm a little more used to it being in a larger city and whatever, but it wasn't like that. They were saying, like, it wasn't like I've just been accustomed to seeing people of color all the time, and that's why it doesn't hit me. That's not the reason, so it's got to be something else. And they mentioned being thrown off when they see the pictures of us sometimes. They're like, oh yeah, you're brown. Oh yeah, I forgot. Like, and yeah, being, I guess the last point for that individual is that it makes them think more of their white privilege. And that's interesting to me, and I think that's a good thing in a way, because, I don't know, it's interesting because sometimes, whether it's people that I'm dating or just friends or acquaintances or coworkers, it just usually happens with people I'm closer to. But every once in a while, I will be the victim of racism, or I will say something about being uncomfortable, being like, I'm the only brown person at this wedding. Like, I am so aware of race and my race or my ethnicity. Like, I'm so aware of my color. Honestly, it just comes down to color. In comparison to others in the room, others in the building, at the event I'm at, whatever. It's just something I've always been aware of, and not always because of it, not some traumatizing racist experience I've had, but I've just always really been aware, like, yeah, those are white people, and those are Aboriginal people, and this is me, and there's some, you know, African American folks, and like there's some Asian people down the street. Like, I don't know, I've just been really aware of that. I don't know why. I like, it's not because my mother even raising me, like I don't think that was something that she ever had a conversation with me about. I don't think it was because we suffered racism and we had I saw examples of it and like was made aware that way, which I'm sure is the case for a lot of people. But that's not my experience, so I don't really know why I've been super aware. I think maybe just automatically being a person of color makes you aware, because eventually, I guess I see. But as a youth, I don't know how much I would have gotten implicitly or just like subconsciously. I would have gained this information that this is how the world works, and being a person of color, you need to know that this and that and the other thing happen, and how to navigate the world. I don't really know if that was a thing in my youth. I really can't think it was. But I thought it was interesting, and like I said, not a bad thing that they are more aware of their white privilege when they're around me, because every once in a while I say something about like, oh yeah, I this person looked at me funny or said this weird thing to me or like asked me a messed up question or just sometimes funny things, like lighthearted things, like some high school student when I was subbing the other day was like, hey, I don't mean to be offensive, but are you Turkish? And I was like, hey, no offense taken. No, I'm not Turkish. I've never gotten that one before. Like, that's a new one. I was like, no one's ever said they thought I was Turkish before. I don't even know what Turkish people look like. But okay, I was like, no, I'm Chilean. Like, I was born in Cardston. I was born an hour away from here, but both my parents are from Chile, and so from there, like, and they're like, oh, okay, and yeah, I don't know, funny things like that, and then I'll retell that story as just a little quip, and then someone will be like, oh yeah, you're brown, or they'll just be like, oh yeah, like I guess maybe sometimes students, well, usually not teenagers, but sometimes other people will just get curious or whatever, or it just depends on their surroundings, right? It depends on what they're used to. It depends on a lot of things. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on that person's thoughts. I guess I can go further with that, because that's the thing. If it's someone that I'm going to be around a lot, let's say I'm sharing a life with this person. Let's say it's like a romantic relationship that develops into a very long-term relationship, that if my partner is Caucasian, which they overwhelmingly are, I would state the case that it's because there's just more Caucasian women statistically where I happen to live in any place that I've lived at than other people, I guess, than of other ethnicities and races and whatnot. But overwhelmingly, my partners have been Caucasian. So if we were to have a long-term relationship, that they would eventually be exposed to things that happen to me because of me being brown. And so that's an interesting thing, I think, for them, that they may never, they navigate the world on their own, and then they have maybe a partner who is a person of color. All of a sudden, they are faced with situations they would never be faced with just being by themselves, or having a partner that is also read as Caucasian. So I think that's interesting. But we'll go to someone else's thoughts about my unbrownness. So someone gave me a short answer. I noticed differences in interests and values and lifestyle before ethnicity. Sometimes those differences are due to ethnicity, but if we do have similar values, interests, lifestyles, experiences, those differences in ethnicity are less obvious to me. Saying someone like me or another friend of theirs that is Filipino, that they have enough in common that they're just seeing us as that's my friend, like that's it. And they also made a comment that it's weird, but I would notice gender differences before I would notice ethnic differences in friendships. So I thought that was interesting too, because I completely understand what they're saying, and I haven't had, again, I just, from a very early age, from my memory, I just always remember seeing race just all the time. So I can't say I relate, but I understand what they're getting at, and being like, yeah, it'd be more noticeable if I was incredibly different from them in like I said, my values or interests and things like that, that then they could be like, oh, like subconsciously be like, oh, they're different from me, and then notice all the other differences. But if it's someone, I don't know, it's just, I'm a very visual person, so I just see people visually immediately, and I don't know what comes first, whether I see what I'm perceiving to be someone's sex or gender, or if I'm perceiving their race first or their ethnicity. Like, I don't know what it is that I see first, but I see it, and then my mind just like labels automatically, and not in like it's not always like a super conscious way, like this is a brown person, this is a brown woman, this is a a African American man. This is an Aboriginal person. Like, it's just so automatic with me that's I'm just a visual person, and I take this information visually. And sometimes I assign other things to them too. Like, depending on my circumstances, I'm like, oh, this is a person of high economic status. I can judge that by what they're wearing. Or this is a person that may be homeless because of the things that they have on them, or whatever. Behavior is what I notice after, because my mind just takes in information quickly and processes it quickly before I even see how they behave. Usually it's, unless their behavior is what draws my attention to seeing them in the first place, like they're causing a ruckus or something. But I mean, if it's just walking past someone and I don't even get to see the behavior or whatever, I just take in this information before, and I make judgments on that immediately. I shouldn't say judgments, those are things that my mind just considers right away, even if there's nothing to make judgments about. It's just like, oh, this is a person. It's not just a person. It's like, this is a brown person that is, I'm reading as a woman, that is, and then age somewhere goes into there too. It's just like, all this information gets processed very quickly for me and simultaneously, it seems. I don't know what happens first. But anyway, they were saying, like, basically, this is a scenario where they get to know me. So it's interesting because, like, if I were to audition for a band and I show up and the rest of the band is white, which has happened to me a couple times. I haven't been in very many bands, but in 2 of them, everyone was white but me, which isn't all that uncommon. Like, when it's in a scenario like that, I don't get uncomfortable being like, oh, I'm the only brown person here. It's when it's a bigger thing that I'm like, cool, I'm the only brown person here. There's 180 people here, but I'm the only brown person. That's awkward. But yeah, within a small group like that, it's not uncommon, and it doesn't make me feel uncomfortable if the people are cool and just like not threatening. But I always imagine like that would be a thing you would notice. That I assumed they would notice too. I walk into the room and I assume automatically they'll be like, oh, there's a brown person here. Like, I'm not a Caucasian person, and I have, like, whatever. Like, and Caucasian people obviously are different from each other too, and I don't know what they all think and how they react. But I just imagine, because that's how my mind works, is like I process all this at once. It's like, visually, I would see myself walk in and be like, oh, there is a overweight, heavy-set, bearded, brown guy who looks to be, or who's in his 30s or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, but anyway, that's just the automatic thing. So I would just assume, and maybe that was the automatic thought for this person, and then over time, as we spent time together, maybe those thoughts went away, and they just and over time they just forget. Maybe it's an initial reaction, and then they just forget. And I never went back to these people with my thoughts, by the way. That's why I'm speculating now. I got initial thoughts, and then I just wanted to talk about them without going back to them for clarification. But they are more than welcome and free to have input on this video / podcast with my speculations based off of what they told me. So in saying that, like, I completely understand in a way that it's like, yeah, we immediately, very quickly, we found the things that we found common ground. Our interests similar, our values, we had chemistry, and so very quickly maybe they kind of forgot that I was this other thing because it's not interesting. That label doesn't mean anything. Like, being a certain kind of different, it's not a different that matters. So therefore, it's void and it's ignored, and we can omit that difference because it doesn't make a difference. For some people that might be gender, it might be like, yeah, it doesn't matter. We're in a band together, so who cares if you're a boy or girl or whatever, and that might be a different, I don't know, that plays with obviously people's romantic interests and stuff too, who they're attracted to. Maybe it would make a difference, maybe it wouldn't. Age might be a thing too, be like, oh yeah, who cares if you're 20, 30, or 40, that age range doesn't matter in this context, so the fact that you're 20 years older than me doesn't make a difference. I'm 20, you're 40, who cares? We have chemistry, we have the same attitude towards things and interests. That's what matters in this scenario. If you were out of the box on one of those things, then I would notice the differences, and it would translate to me noticing other differences, blah, 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 blah. You get the point. So I completely understand that. It's not my experience. I don't think, really, because I'm just always aware of it. That's the thing. When I hang out with fellow brown people, race is something that comes up sometimes, because there's incidences that happen, and especially if we're going out together and then there's more of us, I find that there's more likely to be incidents of where we could be so inclined to assume that things are happening because of our race and we're all together, rather than on an individual basis. But there are just, when I'm hanging out with people of color, I notice color. We talk about race, we talk about those type of politics and the experiences we've had and our personal histories. And the thing is that when I'm around Caucasian people, I notice it too, though, because I just do. Like, I'm comfortable in either space. With Caucasian people, I think it still comes up. It just it comes up differently. And when it does come up, that's when I get some of these comments like, oh yeah, you're brown. Like, we could be talking about something and they're talking about it in the room like I am like them. And I'm not like them in that aspect, and that's nothing I have control over or not. And our views on race could be exactly the same, and that's why sometimes it takes a minute for them to click on the fact that, like, oh wait, we're talking about this thing and you're here and maybe you can give us some insight. It's never like oh crap, we talked about this thing and you're here and you're brown and sorry if that offends you. Like, no, it's never like that with the people that I'm thinking of, because we are in good company and we feel like maybe our humor lends itself to telling racist jokes to each other, and we feel comfortable doing that. And for some reason, it's just, yeah, I partake in this sense of humor at times as well with people that I am in like mind with, and we share a sense of humor. And during those times, I don't think they think about my race. They're not, tiptoeing around certain subjects or things like that because of my race, and that's partly because they forget. In some ways, because I also tell the same jokes or I make the same comments or whatever. But there are times, those are times where sometimes I see it click for them, like, wait a second, like, you have experience with this, or they ask me, do you have experience with this? Because sometimes they're talking about someone else they know who for some reason is different enough from them that they perceive them as a person of color when they don't perceive me that way. Maybe because we're so familiar with each other, we've known each other for years, we spent, times of joy and hardship together in some cases, or just spent a lot of time together in general. So yeah, I understand what this person is saying. That yeah, if I noticed certain differences, it would lead to me noticing more differences. But because there's enough likeness there, they forget about the differences because the differences don't matter. That's how I interpret what they said anyway. That also brings me to this point of being an immigrant. So I'm not an immigrant, but my parents are. And I think when a lot of people hear the word immigrant, they think of people of color, which I do too. To be honest, that's what I think of. However, I've also been upset because I bank at Royal Bank. I have an RBC accounts for the funds that I accrue, and I was at an RBC sometime in the past year. I don't remember exactly when it was, but sometimes in the past year, and I noticed that they had this thing, it was on the screen, and it was this advertisement about so-and-so, something about immigrants. And every single shot was a person of color. And there was about 8 different, shots of these, families or single people or whatever, being people of color that were immigrating to Canada. And I thought that in some ways that perpetuated an implicit racism, because, and we'll talk about that in the other video, the storytime video, about my experiences with racism. I don't know what I'm going to call it, but something along those lines. Because I thought, you are forgetting that people come from, Caucasian people come here too. From Ireland, from England, from the U.S., from wherever, right? People, it's a global, thing. People are everywhere. It could be, a South African Caucasian person. There are white people that also move to Canada that are therefore immigrants to the country. But when I think of immigrant, I also think person of color. Sometimes I just say brown as a blanket term for person of color. I definitely think that. But as to my point that I was getting back to is that I think that sometimes when we are to meet immigrants, because those cultural differences are so immediately strong, whether it's the style of clothing, the accent, even things like smell sometimes, because people have different smells because of the food they eat, that sometimes we can smell someone before we even see them or talk to them, to hear their accent or whatever. So I think that those differences sometimes are so strong immediately, you're like, oh yeah, you're different from me, and you're a person of color, and I have that in my head now. And if we are to continue a relationship of any sort and become really great friends or what have you, I'll probably always remember that you're a person of color because you talk differently than me. You say things differently in the way you pronounce them. Your speech patterns, your diction is different. It's not culturally the same as mine. Again, maybe the smells are different. Maybe their style of clothing is different. And this leads me to this thing that I still have one more person's views that I want to get to. I think I have less to say about their views and more just reading it. But it leads me to this point of that, yes, like I have been brought up in Canada and I was not raised in a Chilean home. Like I was raised in my mother basically just was a single mom for the majority of my youth. And it wasn't like a very like Chilean cultural, like it was just a very Canadian thing. Like she assimilated to Canada very well. She didn't even, there's a whole other subject, but like even like she focused on me learning English, didn't realize that I was so young I'd be like a sponge and I could easily learn both languages if I were to learn English at school and she could teach me Spanish at home. But regardless, yeah, I just don't remember a lot of cultural things that I'm like, I don't know. There's some things that she didn't place important on, like Christmas. We had Christmas and things like that, and we had a Christmas tree and things like this. But I don't remember ever believing in Santa because we didn't have this culture of like, let's write letters to Santa, and Santa gave you this, and Santa gave you that, and Santa. I just remember being like, yeah, that's dumb. Who believes in Santa? But I mean, I got like the Tooth Fairy came, and I just remember not believing in the Tooth Fairy either. But it came, neither here nor there. Anyway, the point is that I was. There's something that happened in university when I was in education, taking my education degree, and there was a class actually called an anti-racism class. And in that class, I was challenged, and I learned a lot about myself. But one of the things that I was challenged, and it was by my professor, was saying that like my knowledge is white. Therefore, I can be more racist than I think I am because my knowledge is white, is what they said. So I'm just using that same phrase because I don't disagree with it. I would change that to mean my knowledge is Canadian. But I mean, it would be like Caucasian Canadian. Like I don't know how to explain that. Like Canada is still, there's a Canadian culture, but that culture is still, I think, perpetuated and established by Caucasian people. Generally because they are the ones who colonized the space and therefore set forth all their traditions and everything else that came from that. So to me, that makes sense. But yeah, they mentioned that, and I was like, yeah, you're right. That is what my knowledge is. I was raised in Canadian schools, and everyone around me was there's so many Caucasian people around me all the time. Like, there was a lot of other people around me at times, too. Like, I always had, I remember even elementary school in Lethbridge, for the years that I was in elementary school there, I remember seeing people of color in my class, not just one or two, like, at least a quarter of the class, if not, 1/3. We had Asian students, there was Aboriginal students, there was me, there was other students that I couldn't determine necessarily. Then I moved to a smaller town in Outlook, Saskatchewan, a smaller town in Saskatchewan, and it was very conservative. It was incredibly white, and I noticed my race more there because I stuck out like a sore thumb. There was like one Caribbean family, there was us, there was like one person that was from Mexico, there was like one or two Aboriginal families. There was like 3 Asian families. But that was kind of all I remember from my high school. Out of 2,500 people, that was basically it from what I can recall at this moment anyway. Where was I going with all this? I would like to know because I have forgotten. Oh, yes, my knowledge being white. So, I mean, I understand that, yes, when someone is around me, like, I don't think I have a Hispanic accent. I don't know. I just have a Canadian accent, a prairie Canadian accent, not a crazy strong one, but it's there, I guess. Like that's just the way I speak. I don't notice an accent, right? Unless I'm trying to have like a stereotypical Canadian prairie accent, I could slip into that just for fun sometimes. I think that's one thing. They don't notice an accent. The way that I dress happens to be, I mean, I've got a different style than some other people, but there's tons of different styles of clothing within people still in Canadian culture that they would recognize as Canadian or North American or Western, whatever you want to call it. So that isn't something that makes me stick out either. And generally, I think, I don't know, I use Canadian hygiene products. I use deodorant and the shampoo that I can buy here, and my diet is fairly Canadian. So there's all these things that I mean, I keep saying Canadian. This is the way I see it. Caucasian, Canadian, whatever. Canada is supposed to be multicultural, and we know that, but at the same time, when we're raised in certain schools and we are around certain people and raised in these areas, and what we see on TV, and all our culture is perpetuating what I would call white culture a lot of the time, just from its origins and stuff. I don't know, because I don't learn much about other. I guess that's the thing. I don't learn explicitly or implicitly very much in a academic setting or even in a casual setting about everyone else's culture. We barely spent any time on Native studies to learn about Aboriginal people, but when we learn about Aboriginal people in the school system, it's in this different context of like, look at what colonialism did, look at what happened to these people. It's never like this is just the way their culture is, let's whatever. It's tokenism and other things. I'm going to get to this last one because I'm going off the rails here. What's new? Okay, so I feel bad that I forget. My white privilege allows me to go around not really noticing that race and color of skin matters because it's never mattered much to me in my daily experience. Moving to Richmond, the most Asian city in North America where white people make up less than 25% of the population, and I can attest to this because I visited my friend here twice in the past 4 years, or 5 years, and yes, Richmond is incredibly Asian, specifically Chinese, more than other types of Asian peoples. Anyway, moving to Richmond, the most Asian city in North America where white people make up less than 25% of the population, opened up my eyes a bit to what it must be like to wonder if the color of your skin is why something happened to you. And instead of being outraged by the experience of racial insecurity like some white people are when they are faced with the tiniest bit of discrimination, I was incredibly humbled by it. I can't imagine what it must be like to go around having that in the back of your mind all the time. And I do know what it's like to go around hearing people casually hate on an aspect of your identity in public and even in friendly spaces, not because I'm white, but because of my LGBTQ plus parts of me, and it sucks. My point is that I'm a bit ignorant of race and why it matters in an interpersonal sense, but I'm always trying to be more conscious of it. I was recently in training where it took me 4 days of sitting with a group of people before I realized I was the only white person at the table. To be honest, here in Vancouver, I know of some people who are the complete opposite, where they fetishize being the only white people, and it's pretty painful and tacky and gross. I get the appeal, but I always try not to comment on or fetishize it when I'm in the minority unless it's relevant to talk about. I know some people think that not noticing race is really bad and offensive, and I get that it's not ideal, but at least I'm trying to keep an open mind and heart whenever relevant topics or issues come up, and always try to recognize my privilege and be chill. So, a couple things I want to talk about with that whole thing. Again, they mentioned that they are aware of their white privilege, but their white privilege almost allows them to forget about their white privilege at times. So their white privilege allows them the ability, like I said, to kind of not even think about race on a daily basis because it doesn't affect them as much. That there's not as much negative impacts of their white skin as there would be negative impacts that I have the potential of because I'm brown, of discrimination or hate crimes or what have you. That's just not as much of a thing that will happen to them, so they don't think about it. I don't know why I put this down. Yeah, they mentioned, I can't imagine what it must be like to go around having that in the back of your mind all the time. And I will say it's not in the back of my mind all the time. And that again, with me, I'm not an immigrant, and I wasn't raised in a household that was fearful of racial discriminations and things of that nature. They weren't even really discussions that I recall ever having. And so I don't think about that every time I go out either. I don't think about like, oh man, something might happen to me because I'm brown. Like, if I'm in certain areas and certain neighborhoods and there's certain types of people around, it's immediate, yes. It would be the same thing as code switching. When you're around certain people, you begin talking differently because you're aware of it. But I'm very aware of, like, I don't think I want to be here right now. Or, like, I feel uncomfortable. Like, there's people here that seem, the way they're talking or whatever, that maybe they are racist or aggressive or whatever, that they don't like immigrants and they would put me in that group, that they don't see. Sometimes I'm aware that people don't see me as equal to them. They don't see me as either Canadian, or they don't read me as someone who was born and raised here and stuff like that. And therefore they think of the visual difference in another way, and that's what they would act off of in a negative way. And yeah, they go on to say, again, my point is that I'm a bit ignorant of race and why it matters in an interpersonal sense. And that's the thing, is that I'm always, like, I'm aware of it, depending on the context. Like, it's always just a part of what's there, and sometimes it's more, I need to pay attention to it more than other times. Like, it just depends. So then they mentioned the whole thing about not noticing race, and how sometimes that can be seen as a bad thing. And we did have a discussion a little bit about what they said afterwards over the phone, and they were talking about, like, yeah, sometimes, like, being colorblind is really not good, and some people take a lot of offense to that, because that's you're not recognizing that they are different and that they have challenges that are different from yours, and that you should be acting differently possibly, or that you're not recognizing the struggle that those people have to go through. And again, I'm very privileged that I don't have a lot of struggles that other people have, and I think a lot of it is due to the way that I dress, the way that I behave, like, and these aren't things that I go out of my way to do. They're very natural to me. Therefore, some people might, again, I think this is one thing as to why people don't even notice, because I was raised culturally the same way they were. And so, I mean, there are other white people, Caucasian people, that were raised incredibly different culturally than they are, and they would notice their differences before they would notice the differences with me, as being like, oh, that person's way different than me, and they look like me, but John doesn't look like me, yet I'd never think of it because he acts like me, or he thinks like me. I think that's worth noting. Yeah, it was just a fascinating thing to me the first time that I had the discussion, like, what do you mean you forget that I'm brown? Like, how can you just forget that? And I've been out with people at times, like in stores or something, and I'm like, this dude's like following me around a little bit too much. And they're like, what do you, oh, really? And I'm like, yeah, like it's not cool or whatever. It's been really rare that I've been out in public with people where I've had an incident that I would attribute to discrimination based on my skin color, or what I would call racism. That is something that I have not experienced often explicitly, and definitely not while other people have been around. But every once in a while it does come up, and then that's just a thing. So that whole thing about color blindness being somewhat offensive or whatever, I understand that, but I also understand that it's not something that is necessarily a conscious trait that someone has, that they want to assume that we're all the same so that they can completely ignore their privilege and ignore my potential struggle and disadvantage. I don't really know how to wrap this up, because, yeah, sometimes people forget that I'm brown, people that are close to me, and I just think that's really funny and interesting and weird, and I don't talk about my race that much, so that's kind of one reason I want to do both these videos in a week. I probably won't get back to this topic for a long time, because it's just not something that, it does not affect my life as much as somebody might think, or I don't think it affects my life. I don't see it explicitly. I'm going to have this video, the story time video, which is going to come out after this, probably by a day or two. And it is going to talk about how I've experienced explicit racism and implicit racism, but it's not enough for me to even, I don't know where I was going with that sentence, but it's, again, it's something I'm very aware of all the time, but it's not something I talk about very much. That's why you don't see it on my art. That's why you don't hear or see me just having conversations about it. On a scale where other people might talk about it way more often. Like I said, I talk about it way more with other people of color than I talk about it with Caucasian people. The other thing is, though, that most of the people that I connect with are Caucasian people. I don't have very many people close to me that are people of color. So these conversations don't come up that often in my life in that capacity. Anyway, watch out for that storytime video. I'm pretty sure it'll be shorter than this. But yeah, that was, yeah, we'll see you on another time.